Nitrogen that enters an ecosystem and then cycles through that ecosystem eventually is lost. And here we'll cover the major pathways of nitrogen loss from ecosystems. Ammonia volatilization, nitrification, and denitrification are the major avenues of gaseous nitrogen loss from ecosystems. So when we think about loss, we're going to be thinking about the volatilization of ammonia. We talked a little bit about that, but that's mostly NH3 loss. Nitrification and the gaseous loss that happens during nitrification, and then denitrification, which we're going to go into more detail here. First, let's cover ammonium. And this part's pretty simple. Dissolved organic nitrogen is mineralized, or the process of ammonification happens, and under certain conditions, ammonium can become ammonia. And as we know, that's a gas that's easily lost from soils. The formula for this is pretty simple. You have ammonium, positive charge on it, reacts with hydroxyl, giving you ammonia and water. And this is a reversible process, of course. It depends on some factors like pH, which determines the relative availability of protons and hydroxyl ions. Nitrogen-rich basic soils, so high pH, lots of hydroxyl around, lose a lot of ammonia. And that's when conditions are the best. So if you have a large pool of ammonium that's being produced and a lot of hydroxyl, you're going to go and produce a lot of ammonium. Secondly, in addition to losses via ammonia volatilization, there's also nitrification losses that happen. And in this diagram, that's primarily going to occur during nitrification, the production of nitrite and then nitrate, during which you'll have nitric and nitrous oxide that are produced as gases. This is not necessarily intentional. Is there a benefit to it? But just some of the enzymatic steps that are associated with this can occasionally produce nitric and nitrous oxides. The amount of nitrogen that's lost to nitric and nitrous oxide production during nitrification ranges from anywhere from 0.1 to 10% of nitrification, or the amount of N that's nitrified. This in general is called the leaky pipe model. So you can imagine that there's a pipe that's connecting ammonium to nitrate, and along the way, as it goes through intermediate stages like nitrite, that the enzymatic processes that are associated with that aren't quite 100% efficient, and a small amount of that is going to get lost as nitric or nitrous oxides. So 0.1% isn't that much, but 10% is actually pretty high, and this can be a substantial rate of loss from systems just during nitrification. So again, here we're covering gaseous loss pathways, and the third gaseous loss pathway, in addition to ammonia volatilization and losses during nitrification, is denitrification. Denitrification is the lower portion of this figure. So once nitrate is present in soils, there's a number of things that can happen to it. But one is that it continues to be chemically transformed, and part of that leads to production of NO and N2O, same thing we found during nitrification, nitric, nitrous oxide, that enters the atmosphere, is lost as gases. And denitrification can go all the way to N2, and N2 is also very easily lost. You can see here that the conditions that lead to denitrification are a little bit different than nitrification. So nitrification occurs under high oxygen concentrations, denitrification under low oxygen concentrations. And essentially, nitrate, nitrite, all of these serve to accept electrons. When oxygen is not high in availability, microbes can use nitrate, for example, as a terminal electron acceptor, and it dumps its electrons onto each of these different forms of nitrogen. So when we think about denitrification, we're really thinking about anaerobic oxidation. And again, remember the definition that we're using of oxidation is the gain of electrons, not necessarily the combination with oxygen. So the gain of electrons under low oxygen conditions of nitrate. So nitrate's being used as an electron acceptor, and we really only have that happening under anaerobic conditions. So when we want to think about when denitrification is likely to occur, part of that is you have to have anaerobic conditions, but also have a lot of nitrate around. Nitrification is an aerobic process. Denitrification is an anaerobic process. As we went through that pathway from nitrate all the way down to N2, that there were intermediates like N2O as well as NO. There's differences in the amount of N2O and N2 that are produced in different environments, and this ratio of N2O to N2 production is variable. This is important because N2O is a greenhouse gas, N2 is relatively inert. So when we're thinking about the production of greenhouse gases from ecosystems, a lot of N2O instead of N2 is going to have a big effect. There's a couple of conditions that generate N2O production, favors N2O production. For example, if there's a relatively high carbon supply or a relatively low pH, then the process of denitrification will stop at N2O, and you're not really going to have a lot of N2 production. So it's important to know that there is variation in N2O to N2 production, and situations like a low pH is going to inhibit N2 production, and most of the nitrogen that gets lost during denitrification happens as nitrous oxide. Okay, last slide for the gaseous nitrogen loss here, and this is really thinking about the short-term and long-term controls over denitrification. So in order for denitrification to happen, you have to have high nitrate concentrations. You need a lot of substrate around. You also need a lot of labile carbon, because remember, you need a source of electrons to then dump onto nitrate as a terminal electron acceptor. A lot of nitrate, a lot of carbon, but not a lot of oxygen, because oxygen has a negative effect on denitrification. Indirect controls 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's a lot of indirect controls on denitrification, just like there was for nitrification. When we look at the indirect controls, having a lot of plant absorption is going to have a decreasing effect on nitrate concentrations, so you're not going to have a lot of plants absorbing nitrate. A lot of litter gives you a lot of nitrate, and high quality litter also helps produce nitrate. If you have high carbon quality, you also are likely to have a lot of labile carbon, and that's used as an energy source under anaerobic conditions to generate denitrification. When you have a lot of root or microbial respiration, that has a negative effect on oxygen concentrations, just like having a high water content or clayey soils does. So if you want to think about what types of ecosystems are going to have a lot of denitrification, you have to have a lot of nitrate being produced that's not absorbed by plants. You also need to have high quality carbon, so inputs of lots of carbon, but it has to be wet, maybe hot, with a fine textured soils. In this case, when we look on the landscape for where denitrification is important, they seem to be in relatively wet places where there's a large flow of nitrate. So agricultural systems, for example, that are adjacent to waterways, there's often an interface between the soil and the water that doesn't have a lot of oxygen in it, but a lot of inputs of nitrate. So in these conditions where you have lots of nitrate and not a lot of oxygen, that's going to really promote denitrification. In addition, if you have temporal variation in oxygen availability, so you get wet soils, dry soils, wet soils, when those soils wet up and the oxygen concentrations are reduced, if you have a lot of labile carbon and nitrate around, those are times when you have a lot of denitrification.